In the United States, many are frustrated by a two-party political system. At several points in American history, Black Americans formed their own political parties to bring attention to issues affecting their community. Today, we're talking about 3 Black American political parties from the 1960s. You are watching Black Belief. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so that you never miss a new video. Revolutionary Action Movement, founded in 1962. In June of 1961, 3 organizations at the historically Black Central State University assembled to create a new Black nationalist organization: the Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, called SNCC, wanted to use the philosophies of Marxism, Leninism, and Maoism to address the political needs of Black Americans. Marxism is an ideology based on the work of 19th century Russian economist Karl Marx, who believed that history could be defined by the struggle between different classes. He observed that this struggle occurred because the economic system of capitalism required several so-called contradictions. For example, capitalism depends on unpaid or low-paid labor to manufacture products at a low price and sell them for a profit. Simultaneously, though low-wage laborers are also the consumers who purchase the product, over time, capitalism requires the production of more and more items, which laborers struggle to afford due to the low wages they are paid. Marx believed that these and other contradictions would culminate in a revolution led by the working class against the capitalist class. Another man named Vladimir Lenin assisted Marx in developing his theories. Lenin successfully revolted against the monarchy and became leader of Russia. While Marx imagined a highly egalitarian society, Lenin advocated for the existence of a vanguard party, which would be hierarchical and work to help the working class accomplish the transition to communism. After Lenin died, 2 of his protégés, Joseph Stalin and Leon Trotsky, fought to replace him as leader of Russia. Later, Maoism further built upon the ideas created by Marx and Lenin by replacing the idea of an urban industrial working class revolution with that of a movement led by agrarian peasants. At first, the Central State University groups called their organization Challenge. After a group member suggested that they read an essay entitled Revolutionary Nationalism and the Afro-American, the organization was inspired to shift its focus to educating Black people and shifting the mainstream civil rights movement into a worldwide revolution. They changed their name to Reform Action Movement, or RAM, or RAM. They wanted to use the word revolutionary instead of reform, but feared that this would get them shut down more quickly by university officials. RAM focused on radicalizing 2 groups: Black working class youth and Black petite bourgeoisie youth. Among Black working class youth, they believed that gang members had the most revolutionary potential because they could be trained to fight against white power structures instead of against each other. Using various guerrilla armies from abroad as examples, RAM wanted to turn gang members into an organized fighting force. They felt that the Black petite bourgeoisie represented the contradictions of racial capitalism. RAM believed that this group, made up of college-educated Blacks, would act as the intelligentsia that would lead Black Americans to liberation. The idea of racial capitalism was proposed by a political theorist named Cedric Robinson. Robinson built upon the work of other Black intellectuals to argue that traditional Marxism had failed to account for the racial character of capitalism. While traditional Marxist theories argued that the emergence of capitalism was a revolutionary break away from feudalism, Robinson argued that capitalism from its inception was fused with racism and served as an extension of the previous feudal system. Racism, he argued, wasn't simply created to justify the transatlantic slave trade or divide working class people. Instead, it had already existed in pre-colonial times. He argued that racialized people within Europe, like the Irish, the Jews, and the Roma, were the earliest victims of dispossession, colonization, and slavery within Europe. Ram's activities included denouncing organizations that did not advocate for armed self-defense and trying to infiltrate these organizations in order to radicalize their members. It was one of the earliest groups to oppose the Vietnam War draft and align with the Vietnamese National Liberation Front. Using the framework of racial capitalism, they drew connections between the Vietnamese fight against imperialism and the victimization of Black Americans. The founders of the Black Panther Party, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, were inspired by the organization's work. Ram's membership lists were kept secret in an attempt to help the organization survive. Its co-founders claim that one of Ram's secret members and mentors was Malcolm X, who became involved with the organization even before he started his own organizations, Muslim Mosque Inc. and the Organization of Afro-American Unity. In order to resist government infiltration, Ram transformed into the Black Liberation Party before effectively dissolving in 1969. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, founded in 1964. After a brief period of interracial rule across many southern states in the 1890s, pro-segregation Democrats regained power and passed laws to eliminate Black voter participation. One of their tactics was to create all-white primary contests. In states like Mississippi, the Democratic Party rapidly consolidated power and the Republican Party was in decline. The all-white primaries virtually guaranteed that Black voters would not have any influence on who won elected office. In April of 1964, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, or MFDP, was created as a racially inclusive organization that would challenge the Mississippi Democratic Party. The MFDP sought to engage voters by holding parallel political activities, like promoting the Freedom Ballot, which galvanized 80,000 people to vote outside of the Mississippi Democratic Party primary for a slate of anti-segregation, pro-civil rights delegates. The result of this protest was a 68-person delegation that planned to travel to the Democratic National Convention and petition to be seated instead of the delegates of the Mississippi Democratic Party, on the grounds that the latter group, which were referred to as the regulars, had been elected unconstitutionally. The Freedom Delegation included activists like E.W. Steptoe, Victoria Gray, Annie Devine, Hartman Turnbow, Hazel Palmer, and Fannie Lou Hamer. Fannie Lou Hamer was born in 1917 and was the youngest of 20 children. She dropped out of school at the age of 12 to work as a sharecropper on the cotton plantations in Sunflower County, Mississippi. Sharecropping is an exploitative system wherein people perform agricultural work on land they do not own in exchange for the right to live on the land, borrow money for work materials, and share in a percentage of the harvest profits. In practice, landowners used deception to limit the profits that were shared with the sharecroppers. This meant that the sharecroppers would always have to borrow more than they would ever earn. This cycle of debt kept sharecroppers tied to the land for their entire lives in a manner eerily similar to slavery. After Fannie got married, she and her husband wanted to start a family. However, they discovered that a white doctor had sterilized Fannie without her consent during treatment of a uterine tumor. This practice was common in the South, as doctors and public health officials viewed sterilization as a way to control the Black population. The Black community even coined a term for the procedure, Mississippi appendectomy, which illuminated both the cruelty and the commonality of the racist medical practice. In August of 1962, Hamer and 17 other activists went to the registrar's office seeking to register to vote. They were surrounded by armed men, denied the right to register, and arrested on their way back home. The owner of the plantation where Hamer worked told her that if she didn't retract her voter registration application, she would be fired and evicted. She refused. After her family's eviction, she moved in with family friends. White men attacked her friend's house by firing 16 shots, which barely missed those inside. Fannie was undeterred. By the time of the Democratic National Convention, the MFDP was cautiously optimistic. Several Democratic leaders around the country had privately pledged their support. Martin Luther King Jr. publicly announced that he would do anything in his power to ensure that the MFDP delegation was seated. The biggest hurdle would be convincing the Credentials Committee, which was made up of 108 party members, that the Mississippi Democratic Party delegation should be unseated. Witnesses from the MFDP delegation testified about the systematic exclusion of Black voters. Fannie Lou Hamer's testimony was the most moving of all. President Lyndon Johnson was worried. The Mississippi Democratic Party threatened to walk out of the convention if the MFDP was seated. Johnson feared that other Southern delegations would follow. During Hamer's testimony, Johnson scrambled to call a press conference in order to force major networks to shift their coverage away from Hamer. Hoping to hear Johnson announce his pick for vice president, news networks shifted audiences to the presidential podium. To the confusion of the news media, Johnson announced that he wanted to commemorate the 9-month anniversary of John F. Kennedy's assassination, which had also severely injured Texas Governor Connally, who had been riding with Kennedy in the car at the time of the shooting. While Governor Connally was in Washington, D.C. at that time and in close contact with the president, the timing of the announcement was strange. By the time Johnson finished this puzzling announcement, Fannie Lou Hamer's live testimony was over. News outlets suspected that Johnson had intentionally wanted to distract from Hamer's testimony. His attempts backfired when the media reported on his tactics and replayed recordings of Hamer's testimony many times over the following weeks to national audiences. Hamer's story of her attempts to vote, her eviction, and her brutal beating at the hands of Mississippi authorities brought many to tears.
I stepped off of the bus to see what was happening, and somebody screamed from the car that the fire workers was in and said, "Get that one there." And when I went to get in the car, when the man told me I was under arrest, he kicked me. I was carried to the county jail and put in the booking room. They left some of the people in the booking room and began to place us in cells. I was placed in a cell with a young woman called Miss Vesta Simpson. After I was placed in the cell, I began to hear sounds of licks and screams. I could hear the sounds of licks and horrible screams. And I could hear somebody say, "Can you say yes, sir, nigga? Can you say yes, sir?" And they would say other horrible names. She would say, "Yes, I can say yes, sir." So, "Well, say it." She said, "I don't know you well enough." They beat her I don't know how long. And after a while, she began to pray and ask God to have mercy on those people. And it wasn't too long before 3 white men came to my cell. One of these men was a state highway patrolman. And he asked me where I was from. And I told him Roosevelt. He said, "We're going to check this." And they left my cell, and it wasn't too long before they came back. He said, "You were from Roosevelt, all right," and he used a curse word. And he said, "We're going to make you wish you was dead." I was carried out of that cell into another cell where they had 2 Negro prisoners. The state highway patrolman ordered the first Negro to take the blackjack. The first Negro prisoner ordered me, by orders from the state highway patrolman, for me to lay down on a bunk bed on my face. And I laid on my face. The first Negro began to beat. And I was beat by the first Negro until he was exhausted. I was holding my hands behind me at that time on the left side because I suffered from polio when I was 6 years old. After the first Negro had beat until he was exhausted, the state highway patrolman ordered the second Negro to take the blackjack. The second Negro began to beat, and I began to work my feet. And the state highway patrolman ordered the first Negro had beat to sit on my feet, to keep me from working my feet. I began to scream, and one white man got up and began to beat me in my head and tell me to hush. One white man, my dress had worked up high. He walked over and pulled my dress. I pulled my dress down, and he pulled my dress back up. I was in jail when Medgar Evers was murdered. All of this is on account of we want to register to become first-class citizens. And if the Freedom Democratic Party is not seated now, I question America. Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off of the hook because our lives be threatened daily because we want to live as decent human beings in America? Thank you.
President Johnson was more concerned with having a peaceful convention and consolidating support from the Southern segregationists. Threats were made against the MFDP delegates and their supporters. Behind the scenes, without MFDP input, Democratic leaders created a compromise. They would offer the MFDP 2 seats, and in exchange, the regulars would still be seated. The compromise also stipulated that the Democratic Party officials would pick which members of the MFDP delegation would fill the 2 seats. Furthermore, the party promised that they would not seat delegations from segregationist state parties in the future. The MFDP delegation refused the deal, arguing that they had come too far to accept 2 seats. They were also insulted that they didn't even get to choose which members of their delegation would fill them. Before the convention, the MFDP had been privately assured that they would be seated as long as they confined their activism to issues related to voter registration only. After the Democratic Party reneged, the Freedom delegation felt betrayed. Fannie Lou Hamer recalled that everybody that would compromise in 5 minutes was the people with a real good education. Middle-income, upwardly mobile Black civil rights leaders saw an opportunity to align with moderate whites while distancing themselves from the more working-class concerns of the MFDP movement. This faction would later call themselves the Loyal Democrats. After the disappointing outcome of the 1964 challenge, the MFDP and the Loyal Democrats still tried to work together, and they eventually campaigned for the Johnson-Humphrey ticket during the general election. At the next Democratic National Convention in 1968, a new delegation composed of MFDP members and the Loyal Democrats were accepted and seated with none of the pushback that had occurred in 1964. But the victory felt hollow for many MFDP activists. Hamer continued her grassroots work. In 1969, she founded the Freedom Farm Cooperative with a $10,000 charitable grant. She used the money to buy land and create a cooperative which would raise food to support local poor farming families. The cooperative's monthly dues were $1, but only 30 families could afford this fee. Another 1,500 families were allowed to become members in name only. A portion of the land was planted with soybeans and cotton to help fund administrative expenses. The rest of the land was farmed with peas, squash, collard greens, and other crops, which were distributed back to the farmers who worked the land. In 1970, Hamer expanded the farm using money provided by the National Council of Negro Women. With the additional land, the cooperative created a pig bank where thousands of pigs were raised to feed the organization's families. Fannie saw the pig bank as the most significant part of the co-op and took great pride in eating the meat that she and the other families had raised. The cooperative also created scholarship funds, provided financial counseling, and established a housing agency which provided subsidized housing for 35 families as well as for Hamer's family. Due to the changing economics of the country and Hamer's declining health, the cooperative dissolved in 1975. Shortly afterwards, in 1977, Fannie Lou Hamer passed away from breast cancer. She was 59. Before we talk about our last political party, let's highlight some honorable mentions. First, the Freedom Now Party, founded by several activists in 1963 during the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. The party supported candidates in Connecticut, Michigan, New York, and Washington, D.C. The party dissolved in 1965. Next, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, founded by Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton in 1966 in Oakland, California. The party was a Marxist-Leninist organization active in many cities and within several prisons. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover declared that this party was the greatest threat to the internal security of the country and waged an intentional campaign of sabotage against it, causing its decline. The party dissolved formally in 1982. Our last honorable mention is the United Citizens Party, founded by John Roy Harper II and other activists in 1969 in South Carolina. Like the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, the United Citizens Party sought to challenge the racist practices of the South Carolina Democratic Party. The party's pressure campaign and organizing led to the election of the state's first Black official since Reconstruction in 1970. The party still exists and nominates candidates for national and state elections. The National Democratic Party of Alabama, founded in 1968. 1968 was a tumultuous year. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on April 4th. Protests in response to the assassinations and in opposition to the Vietnam War continued throughout the year. In March of that year, Democratic Party President Lyndon B. Johnson announced that he wouldn't run for re-election. His vice president, Hubert Humphrey, competed for and won the Democratic Party nomination based on promises to continue the Johnson administration's war on poverty and support for civil rights. Pro-segregation Democrats were angry at the continued support for Black civil rights and school integration. Former Alabama Governor George Wallace decided to run for president as a nominee of the American Independent Party on a pro-segregation, right-wing populist platform. The National Democratic Party supported Humphrey, but the Alabama Democratic Party put George Wallace's name on the state Democratic Party primary ballot. Segregationists had tried similar tactics in other elections. In 1948, Strom Thurmond became the Democratic nominee in several southern states instead of Harry S. Truman, the National Party nominee. In 1964, Alabama's Democratic Party state electors remained unpledged instead of being pledged to the party's nominee, Lyndon B. Johnson. A dentist from Huntsville, Alabama, named John Logan Cashin Jr. decided to take action. Cashin came from an upper-middle-class family with an impressive record in state politics. His grandfather, Herschel V. Cashin, was a lawyer who served in the Alabama state legislature in the 1870s and held several federal appointments in the state. His father was also a respected dentist. John Cashin Jr. got his first taste of organizing in college at Tennessee Arts and Industry University, which would later become Tennessee State University. As a trumpet player in the school's band, he printed 35,000 ballots to help the band win a contest hosted by the Pittsburgh Courier to choose America's best Black collegiate marching band. After college, John went to dentistry school at Meharry Medical College, his father's alma mater. After graduation, he joined his father's practice. The junior Cashin decided to challenge segregation in local institutions. He, along with fellow Meharry graduate and Dr. Harold Drake, successfully integrated a local golf course and the public library. Cashin worked with other Black medical professionals to form the Community Service Committee, or CSC, which raised money to bail out sit-in protesters and fund boycotts of segregationist businesses. In 1962, Cashin and his wife decided to participate in a sit-in themselves, which led to their arrest and gained national media attention. The media coverage led to a boycott of local stores during the Easter holiday, which cost businesses a collective $1 million. Despite numerous victories, Cashin found that the political system was still closed to him and other African Americans. In 1962, when he and other Black candidates tried to run for county-level offices, the county's Democratic Party produced a ballot that only included white candidates. The same thing happened in 1964 when Cashin tried to run for mayor. In 1968, Cashin worked with white allies from the Unitarian Universalist Church and famed civil rights attorney Orzel Billingsley Jr. to form the National Democratic Party of Alabama, or NDPA. The organization created chapters around the state and began to run candidates for several local and county offices. The party saw success and elected justices of the peace, constables, and Board of Education chairmen in Marengo County. In Greene County, a judge refused to allow NDPA candidates on the ballot. The organization took their case to the Supreme Court, which decided in NDPA's favor. After the ruling, the NDPA was added to the Greene County ballot, and their candidates were able to win elections for probate judge and for sheriff with a narrow majority of 200 votes. The next goal for the party was to elect a slate of electors who would be explicitly pledged to the National Democratic nominee, Hubert Humphrey. The presidential election results showed that 65.86% of Alabama's vote went to George Wallace, while 18.72% went to Hubert Humphrey. The NDPA was not only a political party, but also a movement which galvanized voters in Alabama's Black Belt. Throughout the 1970s, the NDPA was an alternative to the racist policies of the Alabama Democratic Party. Cashin ran for governor against George Wallace in 1970 and finished in second place with almost 15% of the vote. Other NDPA candidates were able to win local elections throughout the first half of that decade. By 1976, resistance to the inclusion of Black politicians in the state's Democratic Party had decreased significantly. Black politicians moved into the mainstream Democratic Party, and the NDPA eventually dissolved. Cashin fell on hard financial times in the following decades. He had invested nearly all of his money in the political party, as well as other pro-Black causes. One of his financial commitments was a loan to the Nation of Islam. In 1969, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, leader of the Nation of Islam, sought to achieve his vision of an independent all-Black agricultural community. The organization was able to purchase 376 acres of farmland, which shocked white supremacists across the state of Alabama. Dozens of cattle on the farm were found poisoned or shot by local KKK members. Despite these attempts at intimidation, the Nation of Islam continued to expand. They turned to the state's Black leaders like Cashin for support. Cashin helped raise $243,000 to fund the purchase of another tract of land in Greene County, Alabama. The NOI promised to pay the loan back with interest. However, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad died in 1975, before the repayment could be completed. The FBI became alarmed at the collaboration between mainstream civil rights leaders and more controversial Black nationalist groups. In 1970, the IRS claimed that Cashin withheld $780,000 in taxes. This amount was later reduced, but Cashin's legal troubles continued. In April of 1982, he was convicted of perjury for giving false statements under oath during a bail hearing for a narcotics dealer. Later that same month, he pleaded guilty to 2 counts of fraud for cashing his mother's Social Security and pension checks for several years after her death. For this, he was sentenced to 17 months in prison. John Cashin Jr. died from kidney failure on March 21, 2011 in Washington, D.C. His daughter, Cheryl Cashin, is a renowned professor at Georgetown University Law Center who writes about racial issues. Cashin's activism impacted almost every area of Alabama state politics. His efforts to ensure equal access to the ballot for voters and candidates are still cited by elected officials today. Did you know about these political parties? Which party's history surprised you the most? Leave your comments below and make sure you're subscribed so that you never miss a new video.